Most in our world, even if they can't put a name on it, believe in some form of a God, right? We look at the stars, we consider the vastness of the universe, and we conclude there's got to be something more out there. Or we stare at the ocean and we wonder about all the tiny creatures swimming within, or the big ones too, and we think there's got to be something that's made all this. Or we look at our bodies and marveling at their intricacy, we conclude there has to be a creator, a designer who knit it all together, someone who sits outside of our dimensions. But as soon as we get to this place, we're stuck as we wonder, but what is it? Or who is it? Who is this creator? It's one of the questions that has vexed us throughout our human story. Maybe the one question that we've all held in common from all generations, all times, all over the world. Who's out there? What is God? Well, in our passage today, John, who's one of the disciples of Jesus and a pastor of 7 house churches in Asia Minor, which is kind of modern day Turkey, he gives us the answer that he has. How do we know who God is or what God is? Well, John says that we know God because Jesus, by looking at Jesus. In verse 18, John writes, "No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God, is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known." We know the answer to our question. We know who God is, Pastor John says, by looking at Jesus. We say to that, well, what is it about Jesus that makes Jesus so special? How does he make known to us God? And in the same verse, John tells us the answer. He says that Jesus is the one and only Son of God, in closest relationship to God. But more still, mysteriously, he's not just the Son. John says he's also God himself. And as the Son who is God, Jesus has made known to us who God is. Which then leads to the next question. Well, how did he do that? That's what John tells us beginning in verse 14, maybe the most famous verse of these opening verses of John's letter. Jesus made known to us who God is by putting on flesh, John says there, by becoming a human so that he, as God, might dwell in our midst. In Jesus, as the Message translation says, which so many people have loved, or come to love this translation of this particular verse, God moved into the neighborhood. And as we looked at a few weeks ago when Pastor Brian taught us from Hebrews chapter 1, when he did this, when Jesus moved into the neighborhood, we beheld in him the glory of God. So when we look at Jesus then, what do we learn about Jesus? What does Jesus tell us about God and what it is that God values? Well, obviously many things, but there is one thing that John highlights for us here in our passage. John tells us in verse 16 that when we look at Jesus, we see that God is not a God of vengeance and terror, as many then and even now assumed God to be, but rather he is a giver of mercy and grace. God, in his fullness revealed in Jesus, John says, has brought grace. A few years ago, I had the privilege of traveling to Israel, and on one of those days, we visited Caesarea Philippi, where there once stood this temple that was devoted to the god Pan, who was known as the god of the underworld. And right next to the temple was a deep crevasse that was known as the gates of Hades, or the gates of the underworld. And into this crevasse, the people would throw their sacrifices to appease the fury of the god Pan. Because this is how gods were understood. And as I say, it's how gods are still understood. It's how we understand God. But when God moved into the neighborhood in Jesus, what we saw and learned was something far different than what we had ever imagined or worshipped or feared before. Instead, we discovered about God in Jesus is that God is a God of grace. We discovered in Jesus the unmerited mercy of God, because that's what Jesus told us about God. The opening 18 verses of John's Gospel are actually like one long poem, and they function like a prologue to the Gospel, or maybe easier to understand for some of you. They function like what a trailer is like to a movie to come. When you watch a movie trailer, in a few power-packed moments, you're given a sense of what is to come in that full length of the movie. You're introduced to the genre, the mood, and maybe most importantly, the characters and the plot. Well, in John's prologue, which is his movie trailer to the rest of the gospel, we're told that the main character of the story to come is Jesus. And this Jesus is no less than the Son of God, God himself. And this Jesus has willingly become human to move into our neighborhood, to make known to us God. And as he does so, what we learn is that we have received grace, that God is kind and merciful and loving. And when you turn over the page into the story itself, then that's exactly what you see. You see one story after another of Jesus demonstrating this scandalous grace of God. Almost right away, we meet a Samaritan woman in John chapter 4 who's had 5 husbands and now is with a man who is not her husband. She is the perfect candidate for a godlike smoting. But instead, she receives from him the water her soul craves and the blessing to live a new way. We meet a Roman royal official a page over whose son is ill. All the Jews hated the Romans. The Romans were their oppressors, their enslavers. But rather than casting this man aside, Jesus, who is a Jew, grants the hated Roman son mercy and heals him. Or what about all those gathered around the pool, the disabled, the blind, the lame? All the rest of the Jews had determined that these were the unclean ones, the untouchable ones. You couldn't go anywhere near them, but not for Jesus. In Jesus, God comes specifically to these untouchable ones to touch them. And on and on and on the movie of John's gospel goes, one story after another, illustrating what John tells us about Jesus in the prologue. Which is maybe then why our passage begins by telling us in verse 10 that when God came in Jesus, when the one who made the world came into the world didn't recognize him. Even his own people, the Jews who had been told to expect one like him, they didn't recognize him. And John doesn't tell us why, but maybe Jesus wasn't recognized because the people had been so conditioned to look for something different. Their religion, their systems of belief, their rules, their regulations that told them about what God was like had emphasized for so long the wrong things so that when he finally showed up, they couldn't see him. You know that expression, the wrong emphasis on the wrong syllable? I don't know for sure, but could it be that when God moved into the neighborhood, people didn't recognize him because for so long their systems of religious belief had told them to put the wrong emphasis on the wrong thing? So even if they were looking for God, they were looking for the wrong things. Judgments, rules, legal codes, war, powers, empires, religious purity, riches, temple governance. These were the things they were told God cared about. And it becomes so much the focus that when he actually shows up with grace and forgiveness in his hands, and when he tells people that the law is all about love, and when he spends his time with the outsiders and the drunks and the prostitutes to demonstrate how radical it all really is, they can't see it. They can't see God. Except for those who knew they needed what he had. The ones who knew they needed mercy and grace and the touch of God, they saw him and they received it. They drank it up, and in the end, John tells us in verse 12 that these are the ones who become the sons and daughters of God, the ones who know they need it so much so that when it shows up in front of them, they see it. If God were to show up today and walk our streets, would we recognize him? Would you recognize him? Or have we been putting the wrong emphasis on the wrong syllable? What does God look like to you? Because the message of John's prologue and the gospel itself is that if he doesn't look like Jesus, he's not God. And this is why our vision is Jesus. Because in Jesus we get God and everything else thrown in. And so may you have eyes to see him again today. The Lord bless you and keep you.